Oh, just stand here with me. I'm going to be really short. Good morning. Thanks for coming. Our Reveille session this morning is being delivered by an old friend and shipmate, Dr. Cameron Ritchie. She and I first met in 1992 in Mogadishu, Somalia, when we were on the Joint Task Force Operation Restore Hope. That was a humanitarian operation that stopped the excessive dying of 10,000 people a day. And so both Cameron and I think that that's our ticket to heaven, no matter how sketchy our record is when we greet St. Peter. Cameron is a psychiatrist. She's actually a forensic psychiatrist, retired now colonel of the United States Army, holds multiple faculty positions, and is prolific in both speaking and writing, mostly about disaster psychiatry and forensic psychiatry. Her most recent book is 50 More Shades of Gray. No, wait a minute. Forensic and Ethical Issues in Military Behavioral Health. Cam, welcome.
Thank you, sir. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you all who are here in person and those who are viewing this over the website. Welcome to you too. It's great to be back in San Antonio. My first AMSUS was here, and I've got long and rich memories. What I'm going to talk about today is the intersection between the legal system and the military mental health system. And this is a field known as forensic psychiatry or forensic psychology. I'm going to go over the updates in DSM-5. I'm going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury in the courtroom. And I'm going to end with a subject that you may or may not be familiar with, the possible use of Mefloquine or lariam in the forensic setting. So no financial disclosures, no financial relationships disclosed, etc. So what is PTSD? You all have heard of it and you know it well. You also know that every war produces psychological reactions, whether you call it shell shock or battle fatigue. But it wasn't until after the end of the Vietnam War that the diagnosis of PTSD was given. This is the, quote, old definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic experience which leads to intense fear, helplessness, or horror. This criteria is called criteria A2, and it's very important to note that that has changed, especially important in the disability arena, which we're not really going to talk about today unless there's questions on it. Then you have symptoms. You've got the re-experiencing, the numbness and avoidance, and the physiological arousal, which is useful when you're in the combat zone, but not so much when you're back. It's actually the numbness and avoidance that is the hardest to treat and to deal with and has the greatest impact on relationships. And this causes impairment in social and occupational functioning, and there's a persistence of symptoms. In the old days, by old days it's DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 4. In the old days, you had acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. That distinction no longer exists. So the new days, DSM-5, happened 2 years ago in October of 2013 that the change came in, but it's really been adopted over time. Both the military and the VA have switched to the new definition of PTSD. There's some very important changes here. The first one is that the fear, helplessness, and horror has been removed. And that is good, because what you have is you've got well-trained soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who, when the bomb goes off, they don't sit there and quiver and react with fear. What they do is they pick up their weapon, lay down suppressing fire, drag the body, get out of the MRAP that's turned over, swim out of the canal, whatever else. They do what they're trained to do. But that doesn't mean that they don't have problems later on, especially flashbacks and intrusive thoughts. Then there's been some criteria that have been added, and this is, again, very important. Somatic reactions, physical reactions. You smell that diesel fuel and you get queasy because it takes you back to where you are. Sleep difficulties are really common. Anybody who's come back from deployment just about anybody with PTSD has sleep issues. Depression, and we've known that PTSD and depression existed side by side for a long time, but this puts it into the criteria. And then anger and irritability. And this is especially helpful for therapists to know, or family members who say, you know, I'm just trying to help John and he's back and he's being such a jerk. So anger and irritability are very common. Another point that I like to make that you all know here is that it's not just PTSD. As General Schoonmaker used to say, it's not just that PTSD and TBI are the signature wounds of the war, it's that the blast is the signature weapon of the war. And of course, the blast causes not only TBI and PTSD, but burns, hearing loss, facial disfigurement, and other injuries, and of course, amputations as well. My next book that I'm working on is actually about sexual health and combat trauma. That should be coming out from Oxford next year, and I dwell there quite a bit on the sexual side effects. And you know, you've all heard that suicide, about 2/3 of suicides are related to relationship difficulties. What we haven't yet teased out actually is how much of the relationship difficulties are due to problems with, say, erectile dysfunction from being on SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or other problems with sexual functioning. Again, that's another talk, but what I want to make sure that everybody is aware is that the blast can cause multiple injuries. So it is comorbid, usually, PTSD. This is from the NICO. I love this mask and the art therapy that they're doing there. And this one especially expresses the feelings of damage that many service members have. So the comorbidities, we've already talked about TBI, traumatic brain injury, but you, of course, also have substance abuse is very common. It's really rare nowadays to find PTSD on its own. It's nearly always with pain or depression or one of these other injuries. And unfortunately, you know, we hope, when I was back in the Surgeon General's office, we hoped that we were going to stop the slide into unemployment and couch surfing and homelessness. Unfortunately, I don't think we're doing that, or we're trying to, but certainly some of our folks are going to end up on the streets and are already. Just to remind you, and I know this crowd is very familiar with TBI, the invisible wound, but what's important, again, is that it often coexists with PTSD. And absolutely everybody should be screening for both PTSD, TBI, and Mefloquine use, which we're going to come back to later. So a mild TBI is a concussion. What is still tricky is knowing who is going to have the long-term effects of a TBI. Most statistics are about 10% will have long-term side effects. And the challenge is often differentiating them from PTSD and treating it. A lot of the TBI is now being treated with stimulants. You all may have seen an article recently about the high number of people with PTSD who are on stimulants, and there was a belief that the article by the authors that perhaps use of stimulants was causing PTSD. I actually think probably it's that it's both PTSD and TBI, and they're on stimulants for the TBI. And you can have deficits in a variety of different areas depending on how the brain bounces around. Most important for my talk is a question about whether there's frontal lobe dysfunction, and remember that frontal lobe dysfunction often leads to disinhibition, which can lead to some of the same problems, again, that you have with PTSD. So you've got cognitive changes, impulse control, and acting out behavior. Okay, so what does this all have to do with forensic psychiatry? Well, it has a lot to do with it, and you can have PTSD or TBI be significant in cases of insanity, and I'll define these a little bit more, diminished capacity, confessions, or be useful in terms of mitigation. So to remind you, in the military, what there are sanity evaluations called sanity boards or 706 boards. And that term comes out of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And a sanity board is usually asked about criminal responsibility, capacity or competency, and psychiatric diagnosis. How many of you are familiar with sanity boards? Not too many of you, so I'll go into a little bit more detail. What often happens is you have a defendant, and again, this is in the military system, who has a crime, and the lawyer thinks, well, there's something else going on here. Should I get a mental evaluation? And they usually ask psychiatrists to do these, or psychologists, and a board will often have a psychiatrist, a psychologist, maybe one other. It's helpful if the psychiatrist has additional training in forensic psychiatry, because if you haven't done one of these before, you may not know really what is going on there. And they're asking these questions, and then there's a long version and a short version of the report. And the long version, which contains all of the details, goes to the defense, and the short version goes to the judge, the prosecution, and the defense. And the short version just has the answers to these questions, while the long version has all the details of how somebody grew up, how combat impacted them, psychological testing, and the defense attorney can decide whether to show that in court or not. So these are sometimes asked for a little bit too much, and the local psychiatrists start groaning because they take about a week to do and a long time to write up. But they're very important if there is a question about whether somebody's mental status has an impact. And in the civilian world, you have the same thing. It's not called a sanity board, but usually a psychiatric evaluation. So, for example, the person who jumped the fence at the White House last week was sent to St. Elizabeth's for a psychiatric evaluation, and this is what they'll be looking at. So insanity refers to the mental state at the time of the defense. It has pretty precise language, but the language varies from state to state, and it varies depending whether you're in the military or the civilian system. The insanity defense has a long history, which I won't recap today, but it's had many definitions, and they usually look at whether the person knew what was right from what was wrong and could control their behavior. It used to be an easier defense. Then Hinckley shot Reagan. You all remember that. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and there was a real outcry over whether this insanity defense made it too easy to get off. And many states changed it so it was harder to meet the requirements. And you have what's called a cognitive prong. That's whether you knew the difference between right and wrong, and a volitional prong. Could you control your behavior? And the military only has the cognitive prong, because in many cases you think, well, he didn't control his behavior, but could he have? There's a so-called policeman at the elbow test. If there had been a policeman right there, would he or she have controlled their behavior? And that is hard to tell. So again, the military just has to know the difference between right and wrong, or the technical languages. As a result of severe mental disease or defect, the defendant was unable to appreciate the nature and quality or wrongfulness of his conduct. And by the way, in the 706 board, there's usually a provision also saying, and the psychiatric diagnosis is not just a personality disorder, because many defendants will meet the criteria for a personality disorder, but not necessarily, they don't know the difference. Some other terms that are used in the civilian world, you hear NGRI, that's not guilty by reason of insanity. In the military, it's not criminally responsible, or NCR. Some states, including, I believe, Texas, although I'm not positive, have pretty much eliminated this diagnosis, but can do the guilty but mentally ill. And the idea of guilty but mentally ill is they'll still get treatment after they're convicted. That may or may not happen. If you are NGRI in, for example, Maryland, where I live now, or Washington, D.C., where I worked until recently, you will go to a forensic hospital and you'll stay there until you're judged well. Now, Hinckley is still at St. Elizabeth's some 30 years later, and many defendants may actually decide, I'd rather go to jail or prison and serve out 3 years or 5 years rather than to be in a psych hospital for an indefinite time. And by the way, the food, I'm told, is better in the D.C. jail than at St. Elizabeth's, so there's some rationale. It may be a rational choice to go that way. You also have seen a switch again over time more towards it's harder to be found not criminally responsible. So what about capacity or competency? Competency is actually the legal term, and capacity is what I opine on as a psychiatrist. And there's different types of capacities. There's capacity to stand trial, which is what we're talking about here. There's capacity to make a will, capacity to be executed, and others. In this case, it's not about the mental state at the time of the crime, it's about the mental state at the time of the trial. So many people, especially in the civilian system, are schizophrenic, psychotic, and the psychosis comes and goes, gets better with medication, and you're trying to decide whether or not they're competent at this time. If you find they're not competent, you may decide to medicate them to become competent to stand trial. And you've certainly seen that in cases, again, in the civilian world. Often they may be sent to Butner, which is a hospital down in North Carolina, to receive medication. Now, one of the ethical issues here is if they're facing the death penalty and they're not competent, do you prescribe medication for them to become competent so that they can be executed? And actually, the American Medical Association have said, no, that's not ethical to restore competency to be executed. Other states where you don't have the death penalty, it's easier, you can restore competency there. So the idea here is that at the time of the event, they didn't have the mens rea, or now, how are they doing? Again, in the civilian world, the intoxication may be used to reduce their culpability as a mitigating factor, and the military, intoxication doesn't work that way. So what about mitigation? In my experience, PTSD is used best in mitigation. It does not normally render somebody insane, at least in the court of law. Back after Vietnam, you had some cases that PTSD was used to say somebody was not guilty by reason of mental illness. I have not seen it used that way. However, there's some prominent cases, including one here in Texas that I got involved with, where it was mitigating factors. And I'll tell you a little bit about that case. You may be familiar with it, and it's now in the public record. So there was a former Marine named John Theusen, Theusen. Are any of you familiar with that case? The Dallas Morning News covered it. No, I don't see anybody nodding. So John was in Iraq in the early years, saw some fierce combat, came back to a small town in Texas, struggled, had PTSD, suicide attempts, hospitalized at DeBakey Hospital in Houston, got involved with a young college student at A&M, and ended up basically intoxicated and jealous, shot and killed the college student and her brother who tried to rescue her. Nasty crime. He called 911 right afterwards, admitted that he'd done it. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. PTSD was not used at all in his defense, and his lawyers asked for a relook at the case, saying that PTSD should have been used. I interviewed him on death row here in Texas, and he clearly had PTSD. When he came back from Iraq, he had no supports. This was before all the reintegration and all the supports that we'd put into place. He had depression, he was suicidal, and basically at the moment where the case is, as the judge has said, PTSD should have been looked at as a mitigating factor in that case. And there's kind of a national movement questioning whether anybody who's gone to war should receive the death penalty. That is also outside the scope of this talk, but might be useful to come back to in the discussion. So again, the PTSD or TBI may not have made him insane, but should have been considered. And there has been less discussion about TBI in these cases. I haven't yet had a forensic case where it's all TBI, but I think that's going to be coming in the future. After all, we've had 2.7 million service members to deploy, and usually the estimates are about 15% of them have PTSD, and a smaller number, depending on who you talk to, have TBI. I expect this is going to be a hot issue in years to come. Another issue is Does the PTSD cause the person to overreact to a situation, to perhaps have a flashback? Maybe somebody's barricaded themselves in their house and the police choppers outside, or the yells or the shots, are they triggering flashbacks? And you can have a flashback where you really are out of touch with reality, or you can have a more momentary visualization of what happened back there. Another point that is worth thinking about, we're hearing more and more about the idea of moral injury. Are you all familiar with that? That in general is the reference to the intense guilt that somebody may feel when they come back and their buddies don't, or it may be related to killing somebody, especially a child. The classic one is you shoot a car at a checkpoint and you find out afterwards that you've killed a family of 5, including several children. And that's not quite PTSD, but it's more of an existentialist injury. But what I've seen with moral injury is it's particularly corrosive. I mentioned before that the feelings of numbness and avoidance are very hard to deal with, and often you can't share with somebody who hasn't been there. So the moral injury, again, not covered in the definition of PTSD, but often leads somebody to become more isolative. Classic case that we're seeing a lot of with our soldiers coming back. They are getting in trouble in 2 areas. One's domestic violence and the other is gun charges. And so again, you see quite a few interactions with police. I do some training of police, and this is one of the things that I emphasize is if there's a veteran, make sure that you assess or think about PTSD and TBI. One very concrete reminder, remember the TBI causes your eardrums perhaps to be shattered with the blast. And so you have to train the police to speak slowly and quietly and make sure that they're clear and avoid the chatter and the noise and the choppers. Okay, so flashbacks may interfere with reality testing and may interfere with the appreciation of the nature and quality and wrongfulness of the defendant's conduct. And the defendant may misperceive the degree of threat, so may overreact. Now, these cases are just kind of beginning to emerge now, so I have not, well, actually I did have one case. I'll tell you about this case because this was kind of an interesting one. This was, again, a former SEAL on the eastern shore of Maryland who came to do some training, and he hadn't drunk for a year, and they went out for Thanksgiving, and he had a couple drinks at a restaurant, and he ended up being on the roof of a number of the local buildings, and then he went to a government building, and this is all caught on camera, and he appeared to be clearing each door as he went through, and he would carefully put something at the entrance after he had cleared the room. And then when he was hopping up on the rooftop of somebody's house, they called the police, and the police came, and there was a tussle, and a police officer got hurt. And this gentleman ended up being in jail for a week and then having felony charges for having hurt the police officer. And when I interviewed him, and the defense attorney was looking for mitigation, he was a very likable young man who had served as a SEAL in Fallujah, heavy fighting, who had lost several of his friends from suicide after the war, and also a friend from friendly fire, possibly shot by the American sniper. In a clearing situation. So he had a lot of the moral injury that I was talking about, guilt over his friend being shot, anger at the US government, and by the way, that's another piece of moral injury that you may have, anger at the government that seems to have let you down, and in this case, kind of angry at this guy has been lauded as a hero, and he was actually kind of a cowboy out there. So when I interviewed him, I got kind of choked up because, I mean, he'd been through a lot. And when I testified in front of the judge there about this, and again, this clearing behavior was caught on video camera because he went into a government building, so it was pretty clear that he was kind of reaching over his shoulder and waving people in, and the judge dismissed the charges. which was important because if he'd gotten a felony conviction, he wanted to go into a security job and he couldn't have carried a weapon, and the judge just basically said, go get help, young man. So we are seeing some of this come to trial. Irritability is also a big issue. Again, remember, both with PTSD and TBI. And the irritability I've seen come out in domestic violence cases especially. And so that, again, may well be mitigating factors involved. And the overreaction. A compounding factor, again, a lot of this has to do with getting drunk at the same time, so you've got to kind of piece through that. In the John Tucson case that I talked about, he was very intoxicated when he shot his ex-girlfriend and her brother, and that was part of the reason I think that the original trial, they didn't want to bring up his mental state because they thought it would just irritate the jury. Another aspect that you may see this is in coerced confessions. I have to admit, until recently, I didn't realize how often confessions are false, either because somebody is wanting to claim the glory or glory of doing a bad thing. Doesn't seem like glory to me, but ISIS is obviously doing a lot of claiming that glory. Or you may have people who confess because they're tired of being interrogated or for other reasons. So a coerced confession is one that the psychological vulnerabilities interfere with the voluntariness or truthfulness of the statement. So I'm going to switch topics for a moment here, and I'm going to talk about an agent called Mefloquine or lariam. How many of you are familiar with Mefloquine? Okay, I know every general officer in here is. So this has been an area that I've been looking at for some time. When I was in Somalia with Admiral Cowan, we were all on Mefloquine and didn't think much of it at the time. You may remember there was an episode then where the Canadian Special Forces ended up killing a Somali boy, torturing and killing the Somali boy, and that was caught on videotape, and it ended up to the Canadian Special Forces Regiment being disbanded. Do we have anybody here from Canada? You know this story. Okay, I'll ask you afterwards, if you would, if you'll share your perspective on this. And at that time, again, we were all on Mefloquine, but so what? It was a once-a-week agent. We did know that the day that people got it, the whole unit was sort of got kind of irritable, and they would talk about Mefloquine Mondays or Rage Thursdays, the days that you got it. And my first evacuation there, the night I got into Mogadishu, we had a young kid who got very psychotic who was evacuated out, who had been given 5 Mefloquine and had probably taken them on a daily basis rather than a weekly basis because he was supposed to have 4 left in his little kit and he didn't have any. But, you know, we needed it. Malaria was a big factor. But what we've seen over the last 20 plus years is more and more neuropsychiatric reactions as a result of Mefloquine. And one of my big pitches to anybody who's in leadership here is we should be screening our service members not just for TBI and PTSD, but the third leg of the stool for exposure to Mefloquine. How do you know if they've been exposed? You ask if they've been on an anti-malarial. If they've been on it on a weekly basis, that's Mefloquine. If it's daily, that's usually doxycycline or Malarone. Now, in the US military, we have moved away from Mefloquine, thanks in part to the efforts of my colleagues and I in writing about it, and Dr. Woodson pretty much stopped using it some years ago. First, it was stopped use in Special Forces community, and then pretty much in the rest of the military. Other militaries include Germany, Ireland, and Canada are still using it, although I'm told in Canada they're doing a lot of informed consent so people get their choice. And the Peace Corps in the US is still using it. And there is a lot of discussion now about whether the Peace Corps volunteers are being given proper informed consent, or even if they are and they start to get psychotic in the wilds of Africa, and I've seen this on a number of occasions, how can they get proper treatment for it? So again, this is increasingly recognized, not just in short-term, but long-term reactions. So there's phases of this story. I talked about Somalia. My next exposure to it was at Fort Bragg. You all remember the murder-suicides right after we went to war in Afghanistan. 4 service members, 3 were special forces, 2 of which killed their wives and them themselves, and 2 of which killed their wives. And I was part of the team that went down and looked at it. And at the time, we thought that the incidence of neuropsychiatric reactions to Mefloquine was 1 in 10,000, 1 in 15,000. Some of you who, from the Surgeon General's office, remember those estimates in those days. Now, by the way, the estimate is about 1/4 of people have neuropsychiatric reactions. And when we looked at the Fort Bragg killings, what we found was there was marital infidelity, there was a high deployment, up-tempo, and it seemed like the Mefloquine was, well, maybe a contributor, especially in one case, which I still am concerned about, Staff Sergeant Wright, who bashed his wife to death with a coffee cup in front of their kids and then buried her in a shallow grave, led the investigators to her grave 3 weeks later, and ended up hanging himself in the jail cell. We were not able to talk to him, but by other accounts, he was quite psychotic. Sergeant Nieves and Sergeant Floyd were the 2 other special forces. Sergeant Floyd killed him, Sergeant Nieves killed himself and his wife, Sergeant Floyd killed himself and his wife, and Sergeant Wright, as I said, killed his wife and then himself later. The last one was a cook who had not deployed. So this is what lariam looks like, and this medication has a long and complex history. We actually developed it in the Army at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and then we essentially gave it to Hoffman LaRoche. We did not do post-marketing surveillance on the medication. It is no longer marketed by Hoffman LaRoche. They have basically gotten out of the business. So one of the challenges with Mefloquine is most people who take it do just fine, and those who are having problems, most commonly bad dreams, restlessness, in most cases they stop it and it goes away. But in some cases there is a chronic symptoms. A lot of the symptoms are neurological. It seems to concentrate in the brainstem and the cerebellum, and so people have problems with nystagmus and with balance, and those symptoms may well be permanent. There is a strong advocacy group of folks who feel like they were harmed by Mefloquine. A lot of them actually come out of the Somalia era, and I think there may be a combination of dehydration and Mefloquine crosses the blood-brain barrier. We don't know all the details about how it works and who it targets, but what we are finding is more evidence for long-term side effects. Here's an article from the Danish literature. Another confounding factor is the literature out of Europe is usually on travelers who have gone to Thailand or Vietnam, who have been put on anti-malarials, who may have done a lot of mushrooms or other drugs. And so there was quite a tendency to say, oh, it is not lariam, it's the too much weed they've been smoking. But again, over time, we have seen more and more reactions in our military. Here's an article that came out some 10 years ago, looking at the staining of the cerebellar area in a rat model. Here's another plea. There needs to be more research on this, especially from the VA, because we're not using it anymore. They're going to be seeing people who may have been harmed by Mefloquine. So this is what the black box warning says now, and you see numerous psychiatric reactions. It should not be given to anybody with a history of depression or TBI. And one of the issues that the American military has really struggled with, General Peake, General Kiley, as we went through, is that we will tell our medics to screen for depression, TBI, PTSD, and to document that. But when you look at it in the records, it's usually pretty blank. And what happens is that this is a medication that's usually given out in theater, used a lot by special forces, and may well just be handed out. So over and over again, we've seen that despite the higher-ups saying, you have to screen, you have to document, when you look at the records, it's not there. These are some of the neurological adverse reactions and the post-marketing. Again, in the military, we've stopped using it now, so I think it's in the US military, I think it's going to be more of an issue. My colleague, Remington Nevin, who I've written about, here's a couple articles that he's written, we've written together. He's going to the UK next week to testify for the government. So bottom line on mefloquine is it's probably one of a range of toxic exposures, maybe the Agent Orange of our generation, specifically causing neuropsychiatric reactions that may be long-term, that we really should be looking for. There's been a lot of media coverage about it, and so, which is a good thing. Daniel Zwerdling of NPR is going to be doing something in a little bit. So, I'm going to give you a case example. Who's heard of Staff Sergeant Bales? Staff Sergeant Bales was, of course, the sergeant who shot up the Afghan village. He had been on mefloquine in Iraq. Nobody knows if he was on it in Afghanistan. His symptoms sound pretty consistent. Mefloquine often causes visual hallucinations. He had a TBI. He was prescribed doxycycline in Afghanistan. He was stationed with special forces. The US government had said that he was on steroids and alcohol. Excuse me, my voice is going in a second, but this is my last slide, so we're going to do discussion in a moment. And his defense did not use either his TBI, PTSD, or mefloquine. So let me pause there and take some questions or discussions. This is a picture of the book that came out in 2011, The Book Party, which is Borden Institute. The Forensic and Ethical Issues just came out in the spring. That's also Borden Institute. Do we have a picture of that? You all were going to show a picture of it. These books are available to active duty for free. You can download them. And there is chapters on all of this in there. Let me take some thoughts, questions, discussions, and I think we've got a mic. And I'll just ask you to state your name. And I'd love to hear from the Canadians who are in the third row about what their experience has been with mefloquine. Or others. If you have no experience with mefloquine, you don't have to answer that question. I see no hands in the audience, so I'll pick on General Rubenstein in the front row. Oh, wait, you're rescued. There's a hand in the audience. Because you've been part of the mefloquine discussion through the years, too. I can't see who it is, so if you could just state your name.
Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Commander Banger. I'm a Public Health Service Officer working at the Intrepid Spirit Concussion Recovery Center down at Camp Lejeune, and I'm one of the treatment team leaders. And what we've noticed was in the last maybe year or so that with the high prevalence of PTSD and TBI and lots of overriding symptoms, initially we thought there was, a fairly limited list of overriding symptoms of the typical headache, sleep issues, some irritability, but we're finding more and more that almost all of the symptoms are synonymous between TBI and PTSD. So we started shifting away from treating TBI and not a lot of mental health, because we refer some of that out to the mental health network. And we're moving more toward treating symptoms of these young service members, regardless of the cause of it, whether it was, multiple blast, blunt head trauma, or a very vague, maybe blast injury, and a lot more mental health. What is your take on that?
I think that's a very practical way to go. I think it's almost impossible to tease out what is PTSD and what is TBI, especially since we don't have lab tests or radiology for either of them. So I think a focus on the symptoms. What I would love to see, and I don't think we're doing enough of it, is longitudinal studies of these folks over time. We have a lot of good cross-sectional studies, the mental health advisory teams and others, but I don't know if your group is doing long-term follow-up, and that's going to be critically important. General Rubenstein, you were with me in the Surgeon General's office when some of this discussion about mefloquine was going on, and I was wondering if you had a comment on that.
Actually, I have a question
unrelated, okay.
Related to mefloquine. Hello, okay. Cam, I appreciated your efforts while you were doing your work, not only for the Army, but in large measure for all of the services, taking a lot of bullets and spears on Capitol Hill. And your work and your presentation today talks about the effects, the end result. The question that I have is, from your perspective, what are we missing in the training and preparation of health providers, whether they're licensed or paraprofessional, medics, corpsmen, and also in leadership at the beginning end, at the starting end, at the prevention end when we're deployed? The black box is fine. That speaks to the prescriber and the pharmacist. But what about the squad leader? What about the company commander? What should we be doing to try to short-circuit this? You can't short-circuit the IED, but some of the other things we can short-circuit. Are we addressing that issue, do you feel? Over.
Of course not. So, in brief, I think we've tried, at least since we went into Afghanistan, to be training the squad leader. And we've had numerous different programs, whether you call it Battle Mind or Comprehensive Soldier Fitness, or the stand-down training on suicide to try to train the force. Training is kind of the easy thing to do. I think, and you may be able to help me out here, one thing we haven't yet done is to put the training into all of our leadership schools. So, for example, there's been a lot of attention on sexual assault, and I know that's gone into the leadership schools, but I'm not sure, and maybe you know or somebody else knows, how much of this is in the training for every soldier, because of course it's not just squad leaders, it's every soldier who may become a squad leader. And I think another piece that we're missing is when you look at administrative discharges, and this is an area of quite some concern to me. Our amount of administrative discharges for misconduct is very high now. It's been about 22,000 over the last 5 years, which is much higher than I thought it would be. And I think that we are discharging people. We used to discharge them for personality disorder, and then we essentially stopped doing that under 5-13s. They went out under 5-17s. What I don't know is how carefully we're looking at people who are, say, coming up for a misconduct discharge and really screening them for PTSD or TBI. I see a hand pointing somewhere.
Ma'am? Sorry, I'm over here in the dark.
Great, go ahead.
My name is Tori McGowan, and I'm an emergency physician at Travis Air Force Base. My question goes back to the discussion you had about working with the police and helping them understand how to deal with these these patients who are in crisis. We often see those in the emergency room, and one thing I'm very careful with my PTSD patients is to ask, is there anything that we're likely to do here that will trigger your symptoms? Unfortunately, a lot of times they come to us with their hyperarousal and that irritability already triggered. Do you have any techniques that can help de-escalate those situations to help make that feel safer for them in the emergency room, which is already a very difficult situation?
Great question. And I now work at the Washington VA, and they have a little line in front of the nurses' stations where they put all the PTSD patients. They don't like doing this. This is not what they want to do, but it's because they're very small and crowded, and they get triggered all the time. So, yes, ideally what you would want to do is put your patient in a quiet place, soothing music. Okay, you don't have soothing music in the emergency room. Deep breathing, and maybe having a family member there as long as they're not being triggered by the family member. In another talk that I do, an area that I talk about new and innovative treatments for PTSD, very interested in the question about art therapy, canine, dog therapy, music, meditation. I'm not sure, though, realistically, how much you can do of that in your emergency room, but certainly a calm and quiet place, and recognition that it's an issue is going to be a long way to go.
Okay, Cam, we have one more. Cam, Mike Kutzman, DOD and the VA. One of the issues from the VA's perspective is the perverse incentives to get a diagnosis, particularly PTSD. And there's good evidence to show that a lot of the people who get a diagnosis keep coming back to the VA to increase their level of disability. over a period of time, and then when they reach 100%, don't come back anymore, and you don't see them for treatment. How do we approach and treat a diagnosis that clearly is real? But I appreciate your comment about only 15%, because if you listen to the news media and everything, you think almost everybody has PTSD when they come back. So how do we deal with the fact that there's, as I said, perverse incentives to get a diagnosis, which may then add and contribute to the long-term disability of the person rather than helping them?
Another million-dollar question, and I'm going to make sure I speak in my capacity here as a subject matter expert, and I am definitely not speaking for the VA. So if I were in charge, what I would do is I would give everybody 100% disability, and that's it. The other thing I would do while I'm on that subject is we kick a lot of people out with other than honorable discharges, so they can't go to the VA at all. And again, that comes back to the misconduct, which I didn't really emphasize. Is a problem with that is you're not going to get VA benefits. And I would say anybody who served in combat should have access to care at the VA, no matter what the status is of their discharge. And for both of those, there's kind of economic reasons as well as humanitarian. If somebody is discharged with an other than honorable discharge, often they have real problems with unemployment, with homelessness, end up on the streets. And people who are homeless on the streets are very, very expensive to our society. It would be, in my opinion, much cheaper to just give them health care and benefits. Now, the VA is pretty busy right now. I know that this would be another step to add people to its roles, but if I were in charge of the health system, that's what I would do. And then again, I would try to remove that perverse incentive. I think you might pay somebody a couple more $100 more a month if they all got 100% disability, but that you would stop some of this cycle. And those are both very controversial proposals, so I'm not expecting agreement on that, but it's a tough subject. My bias, though, in general, is to err, and I suspect it's the bias of everybody in here, is to do everything you can for the soldier. Okay, you're going to get some people who didn't really have PTSD who will get benefits. That's okay. Let's treat everybody who served as best we can. With that, I thank you all very much for your attention. Appreciate it, and I'll be here for any questions afterwards.
Thank you, Cam. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll take a short break. Well, we'll get the rest of the crew that'll be in for our 8 o'clock session. So thank you very much for waking up early and being that staunch crew to come in and hear the session. Thank you.